Thank you everyone for showing up to the last talk. I know it must be exhausting by now. And thank you troopers for giving me the opportunity to talk. Before we begin, I want to ask a quick question. How many of you have ever downloaded an app for a conference and put in your data into it? No one? Yes? Have you gone back to see what happened to the app? Like, was it deleted? What happened to your data? And things like that. OK. Let's talk about that. Before we start, who am I? I've been in the security industry over around 6 years. I did consulting initially, then to product companies. Right now, I work at Twilio as a product security engineer based out of California, USA. And I'm really scared of heights. Also, a quick disclaimer, the intention of the talk is not to call out any vendors or any companies. I want it to be in line with the troopers' thought of securing the internet and making it a better place. So it's just to increase visibility and increase awareness. And I did talk about this a lot with my colleagues, and we had a debate of should I be releasing the scripts and tools that I've written, and I decided not to. And also, if something is a little vague, it might be intentional. So come and chat with me later if you're curious about something specific, which was a little vague when I was talking about it. Quick agenda. I'll talk about the motivation behind the app, the hypothesis I started with, the primary research, the testing processes, what didn't work, what worked, and things like that, findings, responsible disclosure, some recommendations, some open questions, and future work. Then we'll have time for Q&A. So motivation. A while ago, when I was at an older job, we outsourced the conference app for the company's annual conference. And as I was in the security team, we did a bit of testing before we released it out. And it was very scary. One of the features it had was, it was called Find Other Attendees, and it had GPS coordinates of everyone leaking. So, well, we did remove that particular feature before we released it, but then it got me thinking, is this a pattern? Like, is this an anomaly, or does this happen with other conference apps as well? I didn't really do much about it. In 2018, I started getting some time to actually work on this. And then in the news, you see these articles. RSA's app was exposing data. It was an API call which the vendor had left unauthenticated, I believe, and it was giving out the attendee information. Same thing happened with the Black Hat 2018 app. The article explains how the researcher got data from the NFC tag embedded within the badge. And then there was also the Conservative Party conference app, which was leaking a lot of personal information about the attendees and the government officials who were attending that conference and had actually used that app. So that was a strong indication that it might be a systemic issue, and there is possibility of good research in that area. So the hypothesis I started off with was many conferences are built by third parties. And when I say third parties, I mean like cloud vendors who build apps for their customers. And the hypothesis was that a large amount of data is available to download or extract, however you want to call it, by just using inbuilt features and not like actually exploiting it. With that hypothesis, I also set some boundaries. No exploits, no brute forcing, no automated testing, nothing that would break the app or cause issues to the conference attendees in any form or fashion. I would only be using the features. And then the hope was that these features had inherent data leak in them. And then the primary research I wanted to do to just get started was to see what were the typical features these apps provided, the kind of authentication, if they had any, and any features that leak sensitive data. So the kind of apps can be largely classified into two, static and dynamic. Static are plain data. You download the app, it tells you where the conference or event is, who's talking, how to get there, and a bunch of information. And then there are dynamic apps, where you can actually download the app, log in, or create an account, and sort of customize it, link your social media accounts, create a profile, chat with other attendees, and so on. More about this later, but just think about why a conference app that you're attending needs permissions to post on Twitter on your behalf. It just seems a little too excessive. The other thing I found was in dynamic apps, the customer of these vendors could actually go in and customize saying, I want this feature, I don't want this feature, and so on and so forth. Types of authentication I found were traditional username, password, email verification, passcode, and also there were unauthenticated apps. Interesting features. Chat with other attendees, list all the attendees, find attendees was one, and a lot more. These were sort of the common themed features that I found, and list attendees in particular seemed very interesting because it was essentially just scrolling down a page of all the attendees, and it had information, everything the attendee had either put in during registration or when they downloaded the app. So you could take an app, download it, open it, and see PII or sensitive data of most people who were attending the conference. With that, we see that there are unauthenticated apps, and then there are apps which have a feature to list all attendees. Combining all of them, or both of them, you have unauthenticated apps which are leaking attendee PII or sensitive data. So far, so good. This seems possible. So moving forward into the testing methodology, these are the tools I used. I have Burp Suite Enterprise, but you don't really need it. All I used it was as a proxy, because remember I said no brute forcing or scanning of any kind, so you don't really need those capabilities in there. So testing methodology. The initial approach I took was I picked a random conference app, either searched in the App Store or found it on Google. Downloaded it, put it through a proxy, browsed the app, checked if it leaked PII. If it did, then note it down, and then go back, pick another one. That was the initial approach I took. I did this for like 10 apps. There were a few which leaked information. There were a few which had authentication. But then as I was thinking about the next steps, it kind of hit me. There are probably many, many conference apps. Doing this manually would probably take me 10 lifetimes or so. Taking a step back, I asked myself, how many conference apps are there? Anyone care to take a guess? No one? A few more zeros. A lot more zeros. So I didn't find a concrete answer, but as I was reading online, in a Quora answer written by the CEO of a conference discovery platform, mentions that there are 1 million individual events every year in the world. And I don't know how accurate that is, and this was from 2016. So there are like hundreds of thousands of conferences happening around the world every year. And as technology progresses, a lot of these cons are actually starting to use mobile apps, because everyone has a mobile phone. Having a mobile app is easier, it's convenient. So that's where things are going. So manually exploring all the apps in the App Store, I don't think that's going to happen, right? So I kind of hit a roadblock. I didn't really know what to do at this point. I was thinking for a better solution, and then it hit me. I can actually write code. Should probably automate some of this stuff. So the initial approach proved my hypothesis, because I did find a few apps that were leaking data, but I had to go back to the drawing board and then sort of come up with a new approach which could automate some of these things so that I didn't have to manually do this for a gazillion apps. The problem there was, how do you group all these apps together? You have like all these conference apps, there's nothing in common. They're all different conferences, right? How do you group them together? As I was thinking about that, I tried to take a different approach. Since vendors build these apps, suppose we take a step backwards, look at different vendors, and go vendor by vendor rather than app by app. So taking each vendor, somehow automate data exposure in all the apps that they've built for conferences, and then move to the next vendor. So even if one vendor builds like a few hundreds or a few thousand apps, then it kind of cuts the work like 1,000x, right? So that was the second approach I wanted to try. Looking online, these are some of the vendors I found. And again, I haven't used them, or I don't endorse them in a positive or negative way. These are just some I found online, and I took enough logos to just fill that slide. And then from these vendors, I picked three: Double Dutch, Kid Apps, which was acquired by Attendify, and then EventMobi to prove my hypothesis. Quick disclaimer, that was completely random. I have nothing against these vendors. I either picked conference apps that I'd used before and then looked at who built them, or just picked them at random. Sorry. The new testing methodology was to manually check a few apps from each of these vendors to see if they leak PII, and then somehow get a list of all the apps built by a specific vendor, and then automate data extraction for all the apps built by vendors. So it's essentially taking a step backwards in the automation process, and instead of going app by app, go vendor by vendor, and look at all the apps that they have built. Doing this, I downloaded 3 or 4 apps from each of the vendor, looked to see if it was unauthenticated and had some feature like list attendees, which would be leaking attendee information. I did find a few built by Kit Apps and EventMobi, but Double Dutch, I couldn't find any that was without authentication and was leaking data. I probably didn't look enough, or I just got unlucky. It doesn't mean that all of Double Dutch's apps are secure. I'm not endorsing that. So now that we have 2 vendors who we know have features like list all attendees, and at least some of the apps that they've built do not have authentication. So the next challenge was to find all the apps built by a specific vendor on either the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store. Look for APIs from Apple or Google. I couldn't find any. I don't think they provide an API that just tells you all the apps a specific developer had built. Again, I'm not a developer. You could probably do it for your own apps, but possibly not for everyone else out there. So then this was kind of a hurdle. I didn't really know what to do at this point because there was no official way of getting that information. So I was Googling around for third-party vendors or other cloud services which possibly provide some information we can leverage to solve this problem. Analytics companies. Again, as I was reading a lot of different answers and blogs to solve this, I realized that there are SaaS companies such as 42 Matters, which are analytics companies. They provide analytics on the apps or mobile apps on the App Store on both Apple and Android app stores. And they also have a lot of interesting information, which included a list of all the apps that is released by a specific developer. If you can see this, if you can see the screenshots, the one to the leftmost, I'm searching for EventMobi in the developer name or the title of the app. And you can also do different kinds of matches like contains or exact match or something. And it has close to 1,500 apps. And then the next one is for Double Dutch, similar search pattern on the iOS App Store that has close to 1,200. And then the last one is for Kid Apps, which has close to 800 apps. One interesting thing I found that was each of these vendors had different number of apps on App Store versus the Play Store. I don't know if it's a 42 Matters thing that had different numbers, or if these vendors were specific to some of either Apple or Google in their business pattern. And 42 Matters also had a lot of interesting analytical data, but for our case, this was enough. This gave us a list of all the apps and the names that we wanted. So now trying to extract data automatically, we know each vendor has an API. The same API is probably used for all the apps that they've built. Is it possible to parse through the APIs for all the apps using features like list all attendees and get all the data that is being leaked? So what I did was I took a non-jailbroken phone. Again, if it had any features like certificate pinning, I just went along. Any friction I faced, like authentication or jailbreak detection and things like that, I passed on to the next one. So put it through Burp, through the proxy. And just FYI, if you're going to try this, if once you put Burp to proxy mobile traffic, just be aware that you have to put Burp to listen on all interfaces, and that can be iffy if you're on a public network. So coming back, put your phone through the proxy, download the app, open the app, and browse list all attendees. That will give you the list of API endpoints that the app uses to get a list of all the attendees. So I took that API and wrote a tool. Let's call that tool 1. I don't really have fancy names for these. Tool 1, essentially, you give it an app. It browses through the API calls for getting all the attendee information, and then just spits that information out. It has all the information that the user puts in it. Could be anything, right? From profile picture to your location to anything an attendee puts into it. So now you have a tool that automatically or programmatically gets data from a single app built by a vendor. How do you extend this to all the apps built by the same vendor? Theoretically, it's possible because they're based on the same API, since it's the same vendor building it. I needed to find what was different from one app to the other. I started comparing burp logs for the two apps from the same vendor to see what was different. Each app had a unique ID based on which a cookie was kind of being generated, which was providing pseudo authentication. Let's call this the app ID. If we can get a list of all the app IDs, then it's easily scriptable to get all the attendees from all the apps built by a specific vendor. But then the challenge was finding the relation between different IDs. KidApp app IDs were sort of 6-character alphanumeric. Event Mobi's app IDs were sort of combination or a abbreviation of the conference name with the year. And it was not always in this case. It was off as well. How do you find the unique ID for the individual apps? Second roadblock. So again, started looking around. But then remember I said from 42 Matters there was a lot of information. So I just went back to look at that information, hoping to find something that could lead me to a different path or get me some more information because I was stuck at this point. I started looking at all the different fields that it was populating. It was super configurable as I was looking through. There were two specific fields in the App Store, in the Google Store and the iOS Store, which were like package ID and bundle ID. I'm not a mobile developer, so I'm not completely aware of what they signify when you sort of release an app to the store. But they looked really familiar. They had the app ID as a part of them. So bundle ID, Bundle ID was in the iOS App Store, and Package ID was in the Android App Store. So if you look at the screenshots for the iOS App Store, there's search for Event Mobi with all the bundle IDs. And the small part that's underlined in blue, that's the sort of app ID that is the only unique part between different apps built by Event Mobi. Same thing for Kit apps in the Google Play Store. The last 6 characters, like after com.attendify.conf, and then everything else is sort of the app ID. OK, so now I wrote a tool. I'll call that tool 2. As you know, I'm not really good with names. To extract app IDs for all the apps built by a single vendor from 42 Matters API endpoints. So now we have tool 2, which gets you all the app IDs for a specific vendor from the App Store. And then we have tool 1, which, given the unique app ID, is capable of browsing the APIs of that specific vendor to get information about the attendees using list all attendees feature. Combining both of these, I could get user data built by user data in all the apps, which was built by one specific vendor. So tool 1 took a few tweaks between different vendors, but tool 2 was pretty much the same. So it didn't take a lot of modifications to sort of do this for both the vendors. OK, findings. Combined between both Kit apps and Event Mobi, I was able to extract sensitive information / PII of almost 500,000 users who had used the app. I'm not sure if they had to put it in or if these vendors had some bridge between registration and the app itself. So if there was that bridge, then the user doesn't even know that their information is in a mobile app. Types of data potentially exposed based on what they're inputting: first name, last name, email, phone number, city or country, more like a location that you're based out of, the bio that you put in, profile picture, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook URLs. One thing I found interesting, which was in a third vendor that I'm still working on, so I'm not talking about that, was that the profile picture that you upload when you take maybe a selfie or a photo from your phone, the vendor did not scrub the EXIF data, and then there was all kinds of metadata about your profile image, such as location, time, kind of smartphone you have, and a bunch of things. Individual stats, again, I'm not great at data analytics, but some simple stats. For Event Mobi, the total number of apps that were leaking data, and when I say leaking data, I mean they did not have authentication and they had a feature to list all attendees, was around 230,000. Data from the top 10 apps, or the apps with the top data leakage, was around 40,000. Something interesting I found was an API call that the apps were making. It was api.eventmobi.com, and it has like an event ID, a section ID, and an item ID. I took those off on purpose. It gives you all the data related to that attendee in XML. Whatever is present, it'll give you that. And there are a lot of specific endpoints per event and then per user and things like that that you can get data from. Kit apps, the total number of attendee information gathered was around 200,000, and the total number of apps leaking data was around 700. Data from the top 10 apps leaking data was around 26,000. Interesting fact about Kit apps was it had a S3 bucket with all the attendee information in it. It wasn't segregated per conference or per app. It was just one bucket with tons of images in there. And before you ask, the bucket did not have public listing enabled, so I wasn't able to do like an S3 ls and get a list of all the files in there. But if you knew the file name, which was kind of long, you could get pretty much everyone's image. And the other thing was, it was kind of interesting that KitApps had sort of this qr.identify.com endpoint. You give it the ID, first name, last name of the attendee, and it gives you a QR code, which I think is for registration or other features in the conferences. So as I was looking at this data, I was wondering like if there are apps from like previous years present. Like now we're in 2019, and usually conferences happen once a year. So if the conference or event is using a mobile app, it's probably going to release one every year. So the use case for having a 3-year-old mobile app or a mobile app for a conference that happened 3 years ago is kind of non-existent. I grubbed through the data I got, and I could find 2015 or 16 in the titles. There could be older apps too, and I was kind of curious to get more accurate data. So back to 42 Matters. Analytics companies do have a lot of interesting information. What I found was it had the capability of doing and or operators in the search. So if I search for 2015 and event Mobi, in the description, I didn't do a description, I did developer name and title. It would show me all the conferences or all the apps for conferences that had both event Mobi and 2015 in either the developer name or the title, and there were 2 of them. Bear in mind that this does not include the ones that don't have the year that they were released in the title. So if there was an app from like 2014 which didn't have 2014 in the name, there's no way of knowing or getting that information. Same thing for KitApps. I did 2016, and there were 2 apps that were released in 2016 or had 2016 in their names that are still available on the App Store for anyone to download. So essentially, we have apps live on Google and iOS stores released at least 3 or 4 years ago. Do you think they'll be deleted anytime soon? Hopefully. So now that I had all these findings, it was time for responsible disclosure. I did most of the work in early 2018, so I reached out initially to both the vendors around late September 2018 about the data leakage. Event Mobi had a good response. I spoke with them a couple of times, and both the vendors kind of agreed that these apps belonged or were owned by their customers on whose behalf they were publishing them. I'm not sure I agree, but I don't think I'm the one to make that decision. So coming back to Event Mobi's product changes, they were working on having the authentication feature available to their customers free of cost. That's when I realized that authentication to these apps was probably a paid feature. And that could be one of the reasons that not many conference organizers actually bought that feature or made it available to their attendees. The other interesting thing that Event Mobi was doing was they didn't want to delete the app that was like 12 months old or 15 months old, but they were going to require authentication on all apps after 12 months of being live. And their explanation on that was that after 12 months, the new version of it releases, so people probably wouldn't want to use it. But if they did at some point, the app is still available, but we'll have authentication on it. So some sort of user friction, but it still exists. This was a pretty good change. It's not what I thought they would do, but it's really good. Some recommendations: if you're a vendor building apps, hopefully you can provide authentication at no extra cost. And since all these features are configurable by the vendor's customers, it would be good if the vendor kind of explained the security implications of features like list all attendees with no authentication and things like that. It would be nice if they can remove the apps after the event has completed or maybe after 1 year. Basically, the idea being that the app should not be on the App Store long after the conference is over. Also, it would be nice to maintain an email address for responsible disclosure. If you are the customer of these vendors and you use third-party vendors to build your conference apps for you, you should review functionality from a security perspective. You should use authentication if you can. Leaving the app open to anyone doesn't sound like much. People could think, hey, who's going to look for this? But as everyone in this room knows, if there's an endpoint that's unauthenticated, people will hit it and abuse it. Also, you should delete the app after the event is completed or after at least your use case of the app has completed. The other thing that I've seen and something that I want to stress about is do not release apps built by vendors for you using your developer ID on the app stores. This is something I've seen commonly happen in the past. For example, a big company, let's say company A, outsources the conference app work to a vendor, let's say vendor B. The vendor completes the app, but sometimes comes back to company A saying, hey, we can release it under our name, but since you're a big company, your developer ID has sort of more weightage to it. So if Apple or Google sees that you're releasing a new app, it would usually go into the App Store faster than if we do it. But the problem with that is there is a certain level of trust with your developer name and developer ID because those are the official apps that you have built. So releasing vendor-built apps on your name, not such a good thing to do. If you're an attendee going to the conference, be cautious about the information that you put, not into just the conference app, but like any app that you use. Do not connect LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. I can totally see if the app wants to use it for authentication, just using the scope to get your email address and first name, last name. But I have seen apps that request OAuth permission to post on your behalf, get a list of all your Facebook friends, and a bunch of other things for which there is no reason. And also, if you really need to use the OAuth connection, like once you're done with it, you can go into LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook, or any social platform, and then kill that permission set. Open questions at this point, and if anyone has strong feelings, come talk to me as well. Who owns these apps on the App Store? They're released by the developer, by the vendor's ID, but they're built for the customer and not for the vendor itself. So does the vendor own it, or does the customer of the vendor own it? And why are so many apps open? Like, I'm pretty sure now that it's because authentication costs a lot of money, but maybe it's also the convenience factor and lack of knowledge that there's so much data being leaked, and there are ways to sort of aggregate all of them together. Future work, I want to expand this to other vendors. I'm working on one or two, for example, the one which had the EXIF data from the images. I still have to reach out to them. That's pending. And then I want to get more statistics on number of conferences and how they're categorized on the app stores. I don't know if there's some sort of a business category on the app store that sort of can get me better numbers. And if anyone has other ideas, I'm happy to collaborate on stuff. Thank you for your time. I'm open to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much for your talk. Any questions?
So in the beginning, you said that there are some apps which have a find attendee feature. Mm-hmm. Did you have a look at any of those?
No, that was a different vendor than the one that I chose at random, so I didn't go hunting for it specifically.
Okay, thank you.
But yes, that would have been very interesting.
Further questions? We have a bit of time left until the closing remarks, so feel free.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. You mentioned the response from the one vendor from Kit Apps. Didn't you receive any response, or did you just not mention?
I did receive a response from Kit Apps as well. EventMobi was the one that made the changes. Kit Apps was of the opinion that our customers own these apps and we're not responsible for this. So, yeah.
So, but still, they were hosting the API, right?
Yes.
That's so funny.
That is correct, and that was my argument too, but I can only push so much.
Anyone else? Doesn't seem so. So once again, thank you so much for your talk and for attending Troopers.